happy to introduce Stephen Laskowski. Stephen is the president of the OTA and the CTA, has been part of the association for close to 25 years now. Over the years, he's been involved in multiple high-profile policies that have had tremendous change on the freight transportation sector, including 9/11 and its impact on cross-border trucking, the technological and environmental enhancements, trucking labor, issues like the trucking shortage, and multiple major truck safety reforms. Stephen's here today to talk a little bit about Driver Inc. Where are we today, where we need to be tomorrow. So good morning and welcome, Stephen. Glad to see that the camera's up and running. Can you just say a few words? I mean, as I bring your camera up, we'll make sure, or your presentation up, make sure that's all working. Perfect. So welcome. I've got your slides up here, and thank you for joining us this morning. I'll let you take it away.
Thanks very much, Charlie, and thanks for having me here today. Today, what I'll do is I'm going to walk everyone through, I believe I have about 20 minutes, to where we started with Driver Inc., where we are today, and as the other slide indicated, where we need to be. And I think where we need to be is pretty simple. We just need enforcement on Driver Inc. from both a labor and a tax perspective, both at the provincial and federal level. So let's talk about where we were, how we got to today, and then where we're going tomorrow. If you can just switch slides for me, Charlie. Thank you. And this will be the one and only slide, and you're going to hear me go on for about 20 minutes here, and then we'll go from there. The first issue up is the evolution of industry understanding of Driver Inc. And what I mean by that is the issue for many people when this started, and I should say this, that Driver Inc., or how we branded Driver Inc., or the practice of misclassification and fraud, has been going in our industry for well over a decade, and the issue continued to grow and grow. In around 2017, when I became president of the OTA, I met with a group of carriers, and we were identifying the top issues. And this issue was by far the top issue in Ontario. And as I reached out to carriers across the country, understanding what it was at the time, and it wasn't referred to Driver Inc., we labeled it as such. But the issue of how can these carriers continue to attract drivers and grow and do what they do when we all know the costs of compliance? And so our focus at the time was to understand exactly that. How can this be done? And I remember at the time there were those out there to say, well, this is the new way of doing business. You know, it's an evolution of standard business practices, etc. And that's all baloney. This isn't the new way of doing business. It's not an evolution of standard business practices. It's fraud. And let me explain that. And I'll explain that by telling you a bit of a story. One, just on the classification, I'll start with that before I tell you the story, because probably help you understand that. What Driver Inc. is carriers asking drivers, or drivers asking carriers at this point in time. I don't think it really matters, but let's just focus on the carriers. Carriers who have developed a business model where instead of hiring someone to be an employee, they say, no, we're going to incorporate you, and you're going to become a contractor. Well, we know in our industry, it's pretty simple how you become a contractor driver. It relates to the truck. You own the truck, or you lease the truck with legitimate lease payments. Not never lease payments, but legitimate lease payments, or you own the truck. Now you are a contractor in our sector. That's not my opinion. That's not OTA's opinion. That's the opinion of WSIB, courts, etc. There are many tenets to being an owner-operator contractor, but the main principle, is the connection between the driver and the truck and payments. They have skin in the game. What is Driver Inc.? There is no skin in the game. They are incorporated. They show up to work the next day with their boots and keys. Somebody hands them the keys in their company's truck, and off they go. So at that point in time, people, now I'll go back to my previous story. What I'm going to tell you is, people say, oh, well, this is legitimate. You can do this. And no, you can't do that without major consequences, legal consequences. And it's no different than I was a kid growing up in Hamilton of pizzerias or bakeries. It's a pizzeria, it's a bakery. Except if you went into the back, and many people did in the neighborhood, we go back and find hundreds of bags of flour. You see, flour was coming in. They weren't making pizza. They were throwing the flour out. It was a front. And they were calling themselves a pizzeria. What they did in those pizzeria bakeries is another question, but they stayed around for a while, so it's highly likely that there were lots of illegalities going on inside those places. And the pizzas were a front. It was a way of shelling yourself. That's exactly what Driver Inc. is. They're not contractors. It's a shell. It's a shell to avoid and hide between legalities. So, what is Driver Inc. according to CRA from a legal perspective? It's referred to as a personal services business. And personal service businesses are a legitimate classification from a tax perspective in many industries. Lawyers, you'll hear this all the time from the Driver Inc. advocates, although you're hearing less and less from them. Lawyers, doctors, they all do this. They incorporate themselves and become a personal service business for a host of reasons. For a driver to become a personal services business, strictly from a tax perspective, not only are there no tax advantages to being a personal services business as a truck driver, from a tax perspective, actually you pay more in tax. So ask yourself this question. Why would anybody pay a lawyer to classify themselves as a personal services business, because incorporation papers cost money, you have to file, etc., then subject yourself to more tax than you would as an employee? Because remember, they don't own the truck, they don't pay lease payments. Well, always go back to my pizza story. Because they're not a PSB. They don't file as a PSB. They have no intention of being a PSB. They've created themselves a shell, just like the other criminals did in my old neighborhoods, forming pizzerias and bakeries. It's a shell to protect themselves or insulate themselves from their illegal activity. Now, what is from an ESD standpoint? And again, we have all this. This isn't my opinion. This is ESDC and CRA. ESDC has said from a labor standpoint, well, we don't care what CRA says from a tax perspective. That's their opinion. From our perspective, if these individuals do not own the truck or are making legitimate lease payments, they're employees. So they are subject to overtime, statutory holiday payments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So companies owe these individuals overtime pay, years of overtime pay, and years of statutory holiday pay. Why aren't we hearing anything about that? Well, one of two things. The drivers aren't aware of this, or two, they don't want to come forward because they haven't been filing taxes. And so the crux of all this is that we have two major players from our perspective benefiting from illegal activities. Companies growing faster than any other companies around. And from a recruiting standpoint, we'll get to that point, why they're growing is recruiters are able to tell them, come, no source deductions. Come down to us. You'll make 15 to 20% more working with us. Illegally, 15 to 20% more, but you'll make it. We'll get to that in a little bit. I'm cognizant of time. So that's where we stood. That's how we got to where we are today. So let's talk about enforcement and WSIB. We'll start with the WSIB classification of driver Inc. So as CTA was working with the CRA and ESDC on the classification of driver Inc. and ultimately the enforcement, which we'll get to in a second, the issue became, well, what about other areas where driver Inc. is out of line? And the obvious one from a provincial perspective is WSIB. And to cut to the chase, after several meetings with the Ontario WSIB, they looked into this issue and said, yes, we do agree with you that there is issues here, and we're going to look into it. The WSIB, after they looked into that issue, informed OTA that towards the end of 2018, I believe, or 2019, that they would no longer be doing random audits of the trucking industry in Ontario. What they would be doing is focused audits on the driver Inc. issue. And how were they doing that? They developed their own filter of their own system of companies that helps them identify driver Inc. companies. Also, they developed a tip line that many OTA members are using to call WSIB to say, this is a driver Inc. company, you need to do something about it. And what I mean by that, why companies are so outraged, they're outraged about driver Inc. for a host of reasons. We'll just do the outrage on WSIB. They're not paying WSIB. They're not paying for any of their drivers. What's happened? Well, we'll just talk to the top 25. So in a period, unfortunately, as I probably mentioned throughout this day, that COVID has disrupted many things in our life, and including some of the enforcement, which is starting to pick up out there. But what they did is they identified about 75 carriers and have since assessed them. The top 25 carriers on the WSIB list in terms of assessments total over $3 million in assessments against them. Obviously, it adds up as we go along. And what you see in here is some smaller companies, but a lot of larger companies, the companies that are saying that they're growing faster than anyone. And we know why. And this is part of the reason why. It's not that they're great service. It's not that they're better than the compliant carriers. It's because they cheat. They cheat on, and they use that cheating to do one of two things: to either grow with drivers on a recruitment perspective, grow their bottom line, or pass their ill-got gains based on avoidance of compliance costs with regards to whether it's payroll deductions or WSIB costs or overtime, et cetera, and pass that on to the customer to gain market share. All in all, what we have here, folks, is an issue that, from a recruitment standpoint, for those on the line, this is what you're up against. You're up against companies who are saying to a really, really scarce resource, quality drivers, come work for us because we'll pay you more. But they don't pay them more. What they're doing is they're passing on source deductions that should be going to the governments, giving it to the drivers, and the drivers are using these ill-got gains as well. So with regards to enforcement, here's what we do know. The CRA has said multiple times that they will be dealing with this issue. They have now said multiple times that they will be going in when they audit trucking companies, saying T4As will be now mandatory for all employees and contractors. They've also said that they will start to take a look at the driver Inc. file. That top 25 list of trucking companies that I mentioned, along with the full WSIB list, the CRA has it, the ESD has it. So what does that mean? It means they have the names and addresses of all the violators the WSIB have identified. We've asked that this be enforced. We expect it to be enforced. Safety records of the driver Inc. companies. When you do an analysis, once you have the names of these companies that have been filed against by the WSIB, you can easily do a safety analysis. And what we found from all of these companies is that they're not the best of the best, nor would you expect of it from a safety perspective. They're the worst of the worst. I can read you all the data that we have, but suffice to say, on this format, we'll leave it at that. They're the worst of the worst. So not only do we have an issue with regards to them cheating, not only do we have an issue with tax evasion, not only do we have an issue with labor misclassification in an age when the federal government is making major changes on the labor side that's creating stress within the management community. You have a group of carriers who are the worst of the worst when it comes to safety. So there are a host of reasons why government should get after these guys. And I can tell you this, that there in Ottawa and at Queen's Park, everyone knows about the Driver Inc. issue. And I can tell you it's becoming increasingly a priority. The issue of Driver Inc. and the recruitment of drivers, I've touched on it a number of times, is a major issue. I think that at the end of the day, and drivers, drivers are people, and people, doesn't matter if you're a truck driver, an accountant, or you work at a bank, whatever the case may be. You're going to look at compliance or legalities and following the rules of the land, just like anyone else. And some drivers have looked at Driver Inc. as a bonanza. No one's enforcing it. I don't need to do this. I can use my ill-got gains to advance my personal wealth. And many other drivers have said, I don't want anything to do with it. It's illegal. I know you can make more money at it, but it's illegal. But as I said, there's another side to the coin. And I'll tell another story on that, and many of you probably experienced it. Recently, a carrier told me that they had hired a driver, and an excellent driver, who came down to their payroll office a month later and said, I got a problem. What's this? And the what's this that they pointed to was the source deductions on their payroll stub. And the company said, well, that's payroll deductions. Well, that's not what my other carrier did. I want this money. This is my money. I tell that story because if that driver becomes the majority in our industry, we got a major problem. And we have a great industry and a proud industry, and this is a pathway we should never take. And the quicker and the faster we get enforcement from all levels of government, that kind of question will never be asked again. With regards to the supply chain reaction to Driver Inc., we are educating the supply chain. Over the next week or 2 weeks, you'll see a major campaign released by CTA on educating the supply chain on techniques Driver Inc. companies use to avoid compliance costs, including Driver Inc., but there are many other non-compliance costs that Driver Inc. companies avoid. Because, let's call a spade here, folks. Once you cheat in one area, you're going to cheat in others, as the safety numbers already show. So you want non-compliant ELDs, go down that road. That'll save you some time and cost. You don't like environmental equipment, delete it all. You can't get insurance, the fraud facility, which we fixed there. Or how about this? Don't even run insurance at all. Have fake insurance. This is all happening, folks. We all know it's happening. And as recruiters, that's what you're up against. And I can assure you this, that the boards at CTA and OTA and my team here are committed to ending all of this. And the last point I'll mention on the supply chain before I've reached my 20 minutes is we are educating governments that they also have a role in the supply chain. Governments are major contractors to the trucking industry in certain areas. So we have written the governments have made commitments that, you know, their suppliers must be compliant with regards to labor and environmental issues. And so we're going to begin to sit down with governments to make sure that their supply chain members that are hauling freight for them are compliant with labor code, tax filings, etc. And this can be done. So with that, Charlie, I'll end my update in terms of the question on the slide of where we need to be. I mean, that's really an easy one, and it's a short answer. This has to end. It's fraud, it's illegal, and it's time for it all to come to an end. So that's all I got to say about that, Charlie.
Oh, I'm sure you could probably go on a little bit longer there, but you know, we are within our window today. But first, my first thought, I'll throw in my 2 cents. I'm just wondering what any of the employees I've ever had in my life would say if I walked in and asked them what the source deductions were and what their reaction would have been. But that's a great story. So we do have some questions coming in. I do want to share. I think we got time for at least a couple of them. First one here, I think you're hitting some chords with our delegates. So as a legitimate trucking company here in Canada, what can our company do to help in the fight against Driver Inc?
Absolutely. So if you're in Ontario or have an Ontario terminal, there's a WSIB hotline. We all know the names. I'll never mention the names because I don't think it's the role of the OTA president to be mentioning names. But many of us know who the players are. Call the WSIB. There's a CRA hotline for tax fraud. Call them. Mention the names that you know, and that will bring about action. Write to your local MP and MPP to let them know as a legitimate taxpayer what this is doing to you. You have to at the end of the day, we shouldn't be frightened to say, hey, we have to there's nothing wrong with competition, Charlie. Absolutely, this is a hyper competitive industry, but we compete on a fair level playing field. We compete on management skills, the ability for us to control legitimate costs, our internal costs. We shouldn't have to compete against this kind of garbage. And you're probably looking at a 15, 20% advantage. That's not an advantage. In an industry where we compete on 2 or 1%, I mean, to have a 15 to 20% advantage, no wonder they're growing so fast. It's a bonanza. So get active, get vocal, you know, respectfully show your anger to MPs and MPPs that you want action on this. You'll see our campaign next week about educating people in the supply chain of what's going on. You know, it's a high-end campaign. Share it with your customers. Get vocal, get active. As we've seen through the COVID-19, many members have been active and vocal on a whole bunch of issues, and it produces results. So I know you're busy running your business, but make this a part of your business.
No, that's great. And you did answer one of the other questions that came up, which is awesome, about sharing the names, or if it's been deemed illegal, if we could share the names. So I have one more question for you, and then for any follow-ups, I will send them to you so that we can include them in our document, just in the essence of time. But if a fleet has Driver Inc. drivers now and wants to kind of move forward and set things up correctly, is WSIB offering any kind of an amnesty where they can come forward without facing huge fines and penalties that you know of? I know you can't speak for them, but
it's nothing that OTA is pushing for, to be honest with you, Charlie. I mean, you're lawbreakers, and you've had a lot of time in the sun. But you know, that's something that I think that's not appropriate for me to answer. I think that if you're a Driver Inc. company and you're thinking about changing your model and becoming compliant, well, you know, we can't help but applaud that, because that's ultimately what we want to do, is rid it. And so I think if you're a Driver Inc. company, that you may want to approach the WSIB and how you get into compliance, but that has to be their choice. I can say this, that, you know, you can pick your poison. You can either change yourself, or the law will come. And I can tell you, we will not stop screaming from the top of the towers on this. So they will come, and that we do have the names. It's funny, Charlie, I just talk on that one. You know, people think that perhaps we're full of BS on this, that, oh, they don't have any names. We have them. And I can assure you that, and trust me, as more and more enforcement comes, I just say this to the Driver Inc. companies who think it's BS. Reach out to your brethren who you also know are Driver Inc. and trust me, ask them the question, because some of them, a lot of them have already been visited by Ontario. And it's our strong belief that ESDC and CRA will be on their door next.
No, that's a fair answer. Stephen, thank you very much for taking the time today to be with us. I know this is a very passionate topic for you and for the OTA, so we appreciate you joining us here with our delegates. So there are other questions coming through, but we're coming into the closing minutes of the symposium, so I will forward those by email. But thank you very much, and stay safe. Have a great day.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Brad.